Ensign Cozzens picked a Congo-class battleship as a target, dove straight at it, and commenced raking it from the stern forward, firing from 8,000 feet through 1,500 feet when he recovered over the bow. Lieutenant Fretwell also strafed the Congo, which was on course 030 degrees T, pulling out at 2,000 feet. While jinking in the retirement, the Fighting Squadron 29 pilots observed a bomb strike the Congo on its starboard side, aft. A Hellcat, which had just completed a strafing run, was seen to burst into flames and go into the water ahead. The pilot was not seen to escape from it. Ensign Dunn and Ensign Turner made a strafing attack on a Japanese destroyer, raking it across its port bow to its starboard quarter, down to 1,500 feet. While en route to the rendezvous area, Ensign Dunn and Ensign Turner saw Lieutenant Williams of Torpedo Squadron 29 make a water landing about 10 miles south of Marinduque Island. With Lieutenant Fecker, who returned, they orbited over the spot for 20 minutes, observed Lieutenant Williams and his 2 crewmen waving from their rubber boat, and finally, being low on fuel, were forced to return to base. The other attacking Fighting Squadron 29 fighters made rendezvous successfully and provided escort for the bombers and torpedo planes on return to base. The torpedo pilots broke off from the attack formation, went into a slight echelon to the right, and began a glide approach. They took advantage of cloud cover from 10,000 feet on down as far as practicable. From here on, they made individual attacks on the ships which were off their starboard bow, still steaming straight ahead, but at about 23 knots and sending up a withering barrage of anti-aircraft. Lieutenant McPherson led the attack, which was aimed at the leading battleship. Lieutenant Anderson came in next, due to his position in relation to the battleship. When he emerged from the clouds, he was unable to get lined up for a run on it. He therefore selected a cruiser, thought to be a heavy cruiser but otherwise unidentified, that was head of the battleships on the port beam of the formation as his target. His aiming point was the starboard beam, and he led 1% ship lengths ahead of the bow. While making this run, Lieutenant Anderson's turret gunner strafed as they passed across the bow of the leading battleship. During the retirement, the gunner saw an explosion amidships on the starboard side of the cruiser. Lieutenant Skidmore made his run on the leading battleship from the 3 o'clock position. He was not in a position to observe the results of this drop. During the attack, his gunner saw 2 bombs from SPI-2Cs hit the second battleship, which was also of the Yamato class. One hit between the superstructure and the stack, and the other hit aft of the stack. The torpedo bomber Lieutenant Skidmore was flying sustained 3 hits by anti-aircraft while over the target area. The gasket on the propeller governor was torn out as a result of a hit by a .50 caliber bullet on one of the blades. What was estimated to be a 40mm shell went completely through the fuselage laterally just back of the radio man's seat, entering from the starboard side. Daniel Joseph McCarthy, aviation radio man, second-class cruiser, V-6 United States Naval Reserve, suffered shrapnel wounds in his left thigh and heel. The blast from a 5-inch shell bent up the fairing at the port wing hinge. Lieutenant Ballantyne came in at about the same time as Lieutenant Skidmore. As he had gone down around rather than through the cloud, he was in a position to attack the second battleship. He dropped his fish from the 2 o'clock position, but did not observe the results. During his approach toward the battleship, his radio man saw an explosion and quantities of black smoke arise from a cruiser in the forward part of the formation on the port side. Although no positive identification is possible, it is thought that this was caused by Lieutenant Anderson's torpedo. Lieutenant Williams' drop was not witnessed by any of the other men of the attack. Following the attack, his plane was seen afire, 15 miles northeast of the disposition, where he made a water landing. During the torpedo attack, with the exception of the lead battleship, which made a slow turn to starboard, the 135 ships did not turn or resort to any evasive manoeuvres. One reason for this may have been that the ships at that time may have still been slightly off guard. However, they certainly were not off guard as far as anti-aircraft was concerned. Anti-aircraft was very intense. The planes retired at 200 to 1,500 feet, jinking as they went, until 10 miles out, where they rendezvoused. They then made an uneventful return to base, so this strike was finished. 1 man, McCarthy, washhurt. Lieutenant John Wesley Williams had been shot down, along with Aviation Ordnance Man Second Class James Eugene Boland and Aviation Chief Electrician's Mate First Class Bronislaw Lawrence Raczynski. When last seen, the three were waving vigorously from their rubber boat, and the strikes went on. The Cabot made another that afternoon, but this time the Japanese had been mauled by several attacks from carrier-borne planes, and they were behaving quite differently. The fleet had gone into two groups, manoeuvring. There were two battleships in each group, each surrounded by cruisers and light cruisers and a screen of destroyers. One of the battleships, Musashi, was seen to be smoking heavily. The planes of Torpedo Squadron 29 started in on the damaged battleship, then she changed course and headed away from them, so they attacked a tone cruiser instead. They could not see the results, but they were sure they secured at least one hit on the cruiser. Then came the fighters, and here is their story. The two divisions of Fighting Squadron 29 fighters attacking the Japanese fleet consisted of many. These include Lieutenant Edward Van Vranken, Ensign Francis Collins, Lieutenant Joseph Chandler, and Ensign Robert Jander, and of Lieutenant Max Barnes, Ensign Robert Murray, Ensign Henry W. Bolsiger, and Ensign Emerald B. Cook. These fighters remained as top cover until the bombers and torpedo planes had commenced their attacks. Then they peeled off to drop their bombs on the battleships in the western group of the Japanese fleet. One battleship was seen smoking and circling in an apparently damaged condition, and Lieutenant Van Vranken therefore decided to lead his division against the second battleship, identified as one of the Congo class. While the Japanese ships fired intense anti-aircraft and later light and medium anti-aircraft against the oncoming fighters. Lieutenant Van Vranken led his division in a dive from 13,000 feet at a 70-degree angle toward the Congo, which was then headed east, approaching it from a 7 o'clock position. Lieutenant Van Vranken and his wingman Ensign Collins drove abeam each other and released their bombs at 3,000 feet. Pulling out at 1,500 feet, they passed across the starboard bow of the Congo and executed a 180-degree turn to port to avoid fire of the units of the Japanese fleet ahead. As they made their turn, they were able to observe that Lieutenant Van Vranken's bomb had landed 100 feet from the battleship, just abaft the port beam, and that Ensign Collins had scored a near miss with a drop 20 feet off the port side of the ship, about 20 feet forward of the fantail. Lieutenant Chandler, in a less steep dive behind Lieutenant Van Vranken, with Ensign Jander on his wing, strafed the Congo from 10,000 feet and continued firing to 4,000 feet, where he increased his lead and dropped his bomb at an altitude of about 3,000 feet. Making 350 knots, Lieutenant Chandler pulled out at about 2,200 feet, and followed by Ensign Jander, who had also released at 3,000 feet, retired in a northeast direction, jinking over Japanese cruisers and destroyers which were firing from below. Lieutenant Van Vranken and Ensign Collins observed Lieutenant Chandler's bomb strike about 30 feet off the starboard side of the Congo, about 80 feet forward of the fantail. Ensign Jander's bomb dropped about 500 feet from the port side of the Japanese warship and slightly aft. All four pilots of this division made rendezvous successfully about 10 miles northeast of the Japanese fleet and provided cover for the SB-2Cs during the return to base. When in his dive and at 6,000 feet, Ensign Balsiger felt his plane jarred by anti-aircraft fire and saw that more than half of his starboard aileron had been shot away. The impact rolled the F-6F around, but it still responded to the controls, and Ensign Balsiger continued his dive, aimed at the bow of the Congo-class battleship, and released at 4,000 feet with unobserved results. Ensign Balsiger pulled out at 2,500 feet, and though his plane was hard to turn, he was able to make the rendezvous and return to his ship. Back at the ship, the flight commander made reports to air intelligence to confirm and amplify what had been said over the radio during the fighting. The reports of the Cabot planes were certainly not exaggerated. On this second strike, the flyers made no claims at all except to having attacked. Nevertheless, in the excitement, pilots reported many things, and there were many pilots reporting because 259 planes attacked the force of Admiral Kurita that day. Lieutenant L.R. Swanson dived on what is believed to be a Congo-class battleship interrogation indicates that he obtained a direct hit almost amidships and slightly to the starboard side. This hit is verified by personnel of VT-19 Squadron. Lieutenant J. L. Butts, Jr. also dived on the battleship, and for an undetermined reason his bomb failed to release. Whereupon he requested permission from the air group commander to make a second attack, for which permission was granted, and he made a one-plane attack on a heavy cruiser. He scored a hit or a near miss. Lieutenant P. R. Stradley and Lieutenant W. P. Waddell are believed to have dived upon a heavy cruiser. The results of Lieutenant Stradley's bomb drop are not known, but it is believed that Lieutenant Waddell obtained a probable hit upon this ship. Lieutenant C. H. Bowen dived through the overcast, corkscrewed around a cumulus cloud, and dropped upon what he described as either a light cruiser or a destroyer. He dived very low, completely blacked out himself and his crewmen, to the extent that his crewmen never did see the ship upon which he dropped. It is not known, and the question of which ship he dived upon cannot be definitely settled. A. F. Droska, aviation chief radio man, who was riding with Lieutenant Stradley, and who was taking pictures at the time, saw a destroyer explode, break in two, and sink almost immediately. The VT squadron in this group did not attack this ship, and insofar as we knew its exploding is unaccounted for unless hit by Lieutenant Bowen or by planes from another air group. We aren't attempting to claim the ship, but feel that the important thing is that it was sunk. Carrier Air Group 16 from the Essex made other strikes. Their report was very heartening to their shipmates when they returned. The VT formation torpedo planes was divided into two 8-plane divisions. Lieutenant T. H. Sorensen's division leading Lieutenant Commander Lambert's division. The former went down to the attack before the latter. Since two pilots of Lieutenant Sorensen's division are missing, it is not known which targets they chose. Lieutenant C. H. Sorensen and Lieutenant L. G. Muskin were the first to drop. When they made their attacks, the two battleships were almost in column with the Musashi in the lead. Of the two pilots, Lieutenant Muskin was the first in. He dropped from 600 to 700 feet at 250 knots at a range of 1,300 yards 30 degrees on the starboard bow. His run was made, therefore, from southeast to northwest, and his target was the rear battleship, the Congo. He states that he had an ideal shot, but that the anti-aircraft was so intense he was unable to see the result. Both crewmen say that the torpedo ran hot, and Lieutenant C. H. Sorensen and Lieutenant Leitner claim that he made a hit amidships. Lieutenant Sorensen attacked the Musashi. He obtained a direct hit aft on the starboard side, confirmed by Lieutenant Bleach, who saw a large explosion on the Musashi on his retirement southward after attacking a cruiser. Lieutenant Commander Lambert and Ensign A. R. Hodges were next to attack the battleships these men had identified as the Musashi. Lambert did not see how he could miss. The two battleships were virtually bow to stern at this point, and he dropped at 650 feet, going 240 knots from 1,500 yards out, 80 degrees on the port bow, and was certain he had scored a hit. Ensign Hodges's crewman said he also scored a hit, and that they heard two explosions as they pulled away over the ships. Lieutenant R. L. Bantz came in next, Lieutenants S. M. Holliday and H. A. Goodwin after them, and the others said Bantz made a hit on the battleship. Crewmen said all three of them did, although only two explosions were heard. In summing up the attack on the Musashi, it would appear that at least 3 hits were obtained, 1 on the starboard side aft, and 2 on the port side. 3 pilots then attacked the Congo. Lieutenant R. D. Cosgrove dropped from only 450 feet, 2,000 yards out, and claimed a hit. Lieutenant R. D. Chaff claimed a hit on the bow. South of the battleships and slightly ahead was a carrier, probably of the Nachi class. This cruiser was torpedoed by 2 pilots in Lieutenant Sorensen's division. Lieutenant William S. Burns said he scored a hit, and the cruiser lost speed as he watched her. Lieutenant O. R. Bleach dropped from 400 feet at 1,200 yards out and thought his torpedo was running true, but he was hit by anti-aircraft fire as he watched and could not tell what happened next to the ship. But Lieutenant Commander Lambert and other pilots said they saw 2 different explosions on 2 different cruisers, and another pilot said he saw at least 1 large explosion on the Musashi. 2 pilots, Lieutenants Paul Southard and W. F. Axtman, failed to join up. Others had seen 1 plane go down in flames, and the other make a hard water landing just outside the Japanese destroyer screen. At the time, no one knew what had happened to that pilot. Later it was learned that Lieutenant Axtman and one of his crewmen had been rescued. Other Lexington pilots that day ran into some very determined opposition by the Japanese air forces, and among them, one of the most successful teams was the division of fighters led by Lieutenant W.J. Masoner, Jr. Here is Masoner's account. We took off at 6:10 a.m., and my division escorting 4 SB-2Cs on a 300-mile search from 275° to 285°. We entered a front spreading from about 50 miles from ship to about 20 miles inland. We flew instrument for 25 minutes, and on emerging from the front, the bombers were out of sight. We finally spotted them circling at 8,000 feet over the eastern shore of Leyte Gulf Luzon. As we came up to join them, they spotted a group of Betty's bombers, and I saw them shoot down too. I saw 4 or 5 Bettys scattering in all directions. I picked one and went down on it with my division. I opened with a quartering shot and rode up on his tail. I observed his 20mm gun firing from his turret. My incendiaries hit his fuselage and right-wing root. He burst into flames and hit the water. The Betty was the bomber that the Japanese commentator earlier had likened to a cigarette lighter because it burned so quickly and then like a Roman candle. I pulled up from this attack and saw 8 Dinahs about 100 feet over me. They turned and spread slightly. I came up from below the right-hand plane and put a long burst into his starboard engine. It started to burn. The flames spread and it fell a mass of flames. During this time I saw 4 or 5 flamers and smokers crash on the shore. By this time no more planes were available, so we rendezvoused and continued our search. About 50 miles out, one of the bombers tallyhoed 2 Nels. We dove down after them and chased them for 5 to 6 miles. I dropped my bomb and then caught up with them. I made a run from above and astern, and his right wing burned, exploded, and fell off. He dove into the water and burned. I started to make Aaron on the other Nell, but he was burning already and crashed. My wingman Copeland got him. These Nels had the new ball turret on their backs, and one of these hit my section leader engine. He was able to proceed, however. We then joined the bombers, flew our cross legs, and started home. As we approached the shore of Luzon, we spotted 5 Nels at about 500 feet, and my wingman and I went down on them, and he burned one which crashed. His guns then stopped, and he pulled up Lieutenant E. Bennett, whose engine was damaged. I made a high quartering run on one Nell and observed hits. I did a wing over and came up under his tail to avoid his ball turret which was firing. I hit him in the fuselage at very close range. He exploded, and pieces flew all over, and he nosed straight down and hit the water. There was no fire. I came up from behind and above on the next. Nelland hit in the wing root, and he exploded, throwing large pieces by me as I pulled up. He burned and crashed. This left 2 Nels out of the 5. I made 2 passes on one of them, and on the second rode his tail until he burst into flames. This was very low, and he hit immediately. By this time, Lieutenant W.E. Davis III, my man, had come down from escorting the bombers, and we chased the last Nell over the land. We each had 1 gun firing, and though we both got good hits, it wouldn't burn. My guns stopped entirely by this time, so we withdrew. There was no question about these kills. Gun cameras from Lieutenant Masoner's plane filmed all 6 of these Japanese airplanes being shot down. There were other stories from this division that gave the same basic picture. Lieutenant W.E. Copeland went after a Betty. It burst into flames and crashed into Leyte Gulf from 2,000 feet after he had made a stern run and given Itone long burst. Then he caught a Nell low over the water, gave it a long burst, and both engines caught fire. He then found a Lily at 2,000 feet over Lingayen, rode his tail and tried to flame the enemy ship, but it would not burn, and the engines died, and it crashed into a rice paddy. Lieutenant Bennett got onto the tail of a Betty and turned with the other plane, shooting it down from 4 a.m., and then got an unidentified twin-engine plane from 5 a.m. which also burned and crashed. I was hit by the turret gunner of a Nell and stayed up high from then on. Lieutenant Davis got a Betty. I singled out one and fired several bursts into it, and it started into a shallow dive and crashed and burned. Did not see any Bettys get away. These were some of the tales the pilots brought home from the strikes against the Japanese that day, and they were obviously very impressive tales. Perhaps it was significant that the pilots of the Lexington's Carrier Air Group 19 were so successful in their attacks. For after all, the Lexington was in the heart of the fighting fleet, and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 38, was riding the Lexington that day. The messages of success came steadily. At about noon, Admiral Mitcher sent a gleeful message to Halsey. Morning search reports 2 Nafori-class cruisers, one dead in water just offshore northwest, tip Mindoro. The other under off west shore Lugang Island, damaged Nachi cruiser in Manila Bay. Enemy has been flying several large groups twin-engine planes from Formosa to Luzon. About 100 enemy planes shot down, now striking enemy fleet east of Mindoro. No reports yet of results. We have another large blip heading from the northeast, launching search 350 to 040 at 1:05 p.m., the Princeton still afloat. Soon Halsey was reporting to Nimitz in Pearl Harbor of the attacks that were in progress, as he was getting the material from Task Force 38. He reported stopping a destroyer, and then hits by the Intrepid planes on a cruiser and a destroyer, bomb hits on 2 battleships, rocket hits on a cruiser and 2 destroyers, and torpedo hits on battleships and cruisers. So many reports that it seemed obvious the Japanese were taking a serious beating in the Sibuyan Sea. By evening it appeared that the Japanese were thoroughly disorganized. Admiral Mitcher reported them milling around aimlessly in several groups. That certainly did not sound like a report on a determined enemy force coming through to attack, but rather like a force that had been cut up and did not know what to do. Further, Mitcher now revised his estimate of Japanese planes destroyed to 150 for the day. Yet another slightly sobering note was observed in this same message. Mitcher thought the loss of the Princeton force of fighters had hurt them considerably, and he felt the shortage of fighters at that moment. In Japan on October 23, after the disastrous submarine attacks on Admiral Kurita's force, Admiral Toyoda's Combined Fleet Headquarters assessed the situation as they pieced it together and renewed the orders to the fleet. It is very probable that the enemy is aware of the fact that we have concentrated our forces. He will probably act in the following manner. 1. Concentrate submarines in great strength in the San Bernardino and Surigao Straits areas. 2. Plan attacks on our surface forces, using large-type planes and task forces, after tomorrow morning, October 24. 3. Plan decisive action by concentrating his surface strength in the area east of San Bernardino Strait and Tacloban, where he has his transport group. He should be able to dispose himself in this manner by the afternoon of 24th, our plans. 1. Carry through our original plans. 2. In effecting the operations, the following points are specially emphasized. Make up for our inferior surface strength by making every effort to direct the enemy to the north, towards the main body of the mobile force Ozawa, his carriers and other ships. Maintain an even stricter alert against submarines and aircraft. Utilize every possible trick to keep enemy submarines under control, particularly while breaking through the narrow strait. Destroy enemy task force carriers with our shore-based planes, while his carrier-based planes are engaging our surface forces. This, then, was the plan. The Japanese were far more concerned on the afternoon of October 23 with submarines than with American air power, quite probably because they had just suffered a disastrous encounter with American submarines. But, equally important, Combined Fleet put the emphasis on the use of the surging Japanese air power in the Philippines for the destruction of the American task force. When it was found, rather than the aerial protection of Admiral Kurita's attack force as it came, under the American eyes on its way to San Bernardino Strait. And the emphasis on luring the Third Fleet north was made much greater than it had been before the encounter of the previous day. The Japanese Second Air Fleet then came to Manila from Formosa with its instructions. Commander Mariyoshi Yamaguchi, operations officer of Second Air Fleet, said the first mission of Second Air Fleet was to attack the task force and wipe out the American landing force in Leyte Gulf. The second mission would be to fight back the Army landing force. As for the naval forces steaming in, there was no basic plan for their protection because there were not enough planes to do both jobs. In a way, the Japanese concept was not so much different from the concepts of air power enthusiasts everywhere. But it was a far cry from concept to execution, and while the Japanese concept of wiping out the task forces by hitting the carriers was sound enough, It was sound only if the Japanese had the power to do so, and most certainly they did not have it. Whether or not the Japanese planners knew, that is still questionable, but it was part of the one big battle miasma that they would hypnotize themselves into forgetting what was impossible even when they knew it was impossible. More or less, said Commander Yamaguchi, 10 fighters were above fleet movements. 10 airplanes was standard to be above a fleet, and it was planned that from Clark Field the Japanese air forces would fan out and provide anti-submarine patrol all the way, but how it was planned and how it worked were two different matters. On October 24, the Japanese at Clark Field sent out the planes that Kurita had planned to have above him, but they did not do the job. How could they? The pilots of the Lexington reported what happened to those Japanese planes as soon as they headed for an area where the American air strikes were operating. It had been a great relief for Admiral Kurita to transfer from his perilous perch on the destroyer to the Yamato, because he had been almost totally out of communication with his fleet during the destroyer period. All they could do was use the blinkers, yet even on the Yamato there were problems. Half the communications personnel had been lost in the torpedoing of the Akagi, and this was to hamper Kurita in the coming battle. Early on the morning of October 24, as the force headed through the Sibuyan Sea, Admiral Kurita knew he was likely to be running a steel gauntlet in a few hours, and that he would have to protect himself. The plan was for the planes to attack, not defend. Still, Admiral Kurita sent the word to Manila that he wanted fighters. The word was heard loud and clear throughout the battle. Communications between Kurita and Japanese headquarters around Manila were very good. The fighter escort did not come, nor did Kurita really expect it. Because he had so few planes, Admiral Onishi was thinking desperately of kamikaze attacks, not of an attempt to provide air cover for the fleet. And as for army planes, apparently the liaison between army and navy on the operational level was so incomplete that no naval officer knew how many army planes might be available, if any. Kurita was in no position to make a request directly of the army, at any rate, and Kurita's first warning of what was to come arrived early, when Manila radioed the news of the morning strikes around the Luzon airfields. Kurita knew it would not be long. Then his radar picked up American planes as blips on the screen when they were about 60 to 70 miles out from him. The Japanese waited. They waited until after 1000, speeding along as they were through the sea, heading for San Bernardino Strait. From 8:39 a.m. on, the Japanese ships were at the alert, maneuvering for defense, zigzagging, with their crews at the anti-aircraft guns and the lookouts ready. The Japanese counted 30 carrier planes in the first wave that attacked them that morning. Here is Admiral Ugaki's recollection of the attack. At 10:40 a.m. this side of the channel, north of Tablas Island, just as we were thinking that the enemy should be putting in an appearance, about 25 enemy planes came into sight. We shot down 23 enemy planes, B-2C, torpedo bomber fighters, and F-6F and thought, well, this isn't too bad. But just the same, Myoko sustained one direct torpedo hit and fell behind. The flag of Cruiser Division 5 was transferred to Haguro, and Myoko, escorted by one destroyer, headed west. The Admiral's recollection was faulty, or there was so much buzzing in the air above the fleet that his sources gave him much duplicate information. For the fact was that during the whole day the Americans lost only 18 planes of the more than 250 flights made over this fleet, but that was the way of battle. Misinformation was as common as information, and hard to distinguish. The Myoko was a type cruiser, over 203 metres long, with a displacement just short of 15,000 tons, and capable of a speed of 33.8 knots. She was built at Yokosuka Naval Base in 1929 and later modernised. On this day she was still a tough fighting ship, although not of the class of Akagi, for example. When the American airstrike came in, the Yamato's radar was first to pick up the enemy and gave the news through the fleet. Congo was first to open fire, and then the others saw and began shooting. The fleet was moving along at 18 knots at this time. There was some confusion about 20 minutes later when the destroyer Akishimo reported a submarine where there was no submarine. Then came a number of stranger reports. The Noshiro sighted a submarine. The Naguro sighted a small aircraft carrier. The Nagato really did sight American planes in a new wave bearing in on them at 10:25 a.m. Japanese and American times differ in these actions. Both are used in order to give the comparative feelings, even at the expense of historical accuracy. The fleet opened fire, sending up a very strong and impressive barrage of anti-aircraft shells. 4 minutes later, torpedo bombers came in on the Myoko from the bow, and the captain saw the wake of a torpedo coming and evaded, but one of the torpedoes struck the starboard side. Aft, the engines stopped. The after-starboard generator room, the after-engine room, the inner and outer shaft rooms to starboard, and the electrical system all began to suffer. Soon the rooms were flooded, and the electrical system broke down. The ship began to list heavily to starboard, and the crew shifted gear and heavy equipment as rapidly as possible. Port compartments were flooded, and fuel oil was shifted. As temporary repairs were undertaken, the divisional flag was shifted, and then, at 11:38 a.m., the Myoko was sent on her way, back to Brunei, out of the battle. She could make 18 knots, but she could not be expected to keep up with the fleet or fight with the others now. The Americans soon came over again, attacking the 2 Japanese formations with the battleships in the middle, and the ships retorted as best they could, like angry cats, spitting up their hail of steel and fire against the planes. According to Admiral Ugaki, there was a visual message from Musashi, a battleship, to the effect that she had received a torpedo hit on her starboard side, but that her speed was unimpeded. Strange as that sounds, it was true at the time. Musashi was a huge fighting machine heavily armoured, and bombs tended to bounce off her armour plate. Yamato took a torpedo, but she too steamed sturdily along. "If this is the extent of the damage, it isn't too bad," wrote Admiral Ugaki, who was keeping a running diary of the fight. But at 1:30 p.m. a third wave of planes appeared. Here is Admiral Ugaki's doleful account of the battle and the loss of one of his favourite ships. From before this, the outer skin of Musashi's portbow had become peeled, causing a larger wake. Since the maintenance of high speed became increasingly difficult for Musashi, all ships were warned to reduce speed to 22 knots and carry out evasive manoeuvres, but Musashi still continued to fall behind. Then Musashi was again hit by a torpedo, and Yamato sustained 1 bomb hit and 1 near miss on the bow. The other near misses and evaded torpedoes were too numerous to enumerate, and the small number of enemy planes shot down is regrettable. Since Musashi continued to fall behind, and there was no hope of her accompanying us, it was decided to have her head for Manila, escorted by the destroyer Kiyoshimo. At 2:26 p.m. a fourth wave of 50 planes, and at 3:20 p.m. a fifth wave of 8,100 planes attacked. Nagato, the battleship, sustained 2 hits amidships. In the fifth attack, Musashi, which was putting up a desperate fight a considerable distance from the main body, started emitting black smoke and listing to port, and became unnavigable. Becoming apprehensive about the situation, Musashi requested the dispatch of another destroyer. The second section, using its judgment, dispatched tone for us. The Musashi was taking a terrible beating, and although she was a stout battleship, no ship could for long sustain power with 10 torpedoes in her, as the Musashi had. She had also been hit and suffered near misses by many bombs, and even a near miss is enough to start rivets, loosen seams, and throw structural members of a ship out of line, weakening her in many ways that may not immediately be apparent to the eye. Then she had 19 torpedoes in her, and perhaps 17 actual bomb hits. The Yamato and the Nagato had been hit, and the battleship Haruna was damaged by a series of near misses. Now, by mid-afternoon, the force of Admiral Kurita had suffered seriously. Whatever would happen to the Musashi, it was obvious she was not going to go much farther into Philippine waters, with those American planes after her, and her situation so grave. Still, Admiral Kurita's force was very strong. He had 4 battleships still going, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers. Several destroyers had been sent back to escort or help the stricken Musashi and Myoko. By this time, the Kurita force was located in the Sibuyan Sea, some 20 miles northeast of the north end of Tablas Island. The ships of the fleet were disposed in 2 circular formations, about 8 miles apart, with the bigger ships in the middle and the destroyers outside. This formation gave the new anti-aircraft guns the power they needed, and made the Americans very much aware of effective anti-aircraft fire as they dived in. but it was a difficult formation to maintain and take evasive action, and when ships were hit, the whole picture changed. By noon, the force had broken up and reformed, and the Musashi, with her plating torn loose at the bow, was literally ploughing the sea, as Admiral Ugaki noted in his diary. Admiral Kurita that afternoon notified Combined Fleet Headquarters. The first striking force is engaged in hard fighting in Sibuyan Sea. Enemy air attacks are expected to increase, request land-based air forces, and Mobile Force Ozawa to make prompt attacks on enemy carrier force, estimated to be at Leyte Bay. This was a plea for help, of course, but it was not one that the Japanese could do much about. They had already begun attacking the American carrier force, and absolutely all they got out of it was the lucky hit on the Princeton that eventually destroyed her that day. The Japanese ploughed on, without the Musashi, but at their deuced speed of 18 knots because of the damage to the ships from the air attacks. At 3:30 p.m., Admiral Kurita's staff estimated that they would be attacked 3 more times that afternoon before sundown. They also roused to several submarine scares, and the destroyer Akishimo carried out a depth charge attack on a submarine that did not exist. Combined Fleet was preoccupied with the submarine menace, and while the ships of the Japanese fleet were licking their wounds and repairing damages between air attacks, a message came warning them specifically of submarines that might get them before they approached San Bernardino Strait. "Be alert," said the message. "Be alert." How could Kurita be anything else with this rain of steel pouring down out of the sky, and the buzz of diving planes that scarcely stopped echoing in his ears between airstrikes? Recklessness alone kept the fleet on its course, said Masanori Ito in his study of the Imperial Japanese Navy. That recklessness, of course, was planned, for Admiral Kurita expected to lose half his ships in this operation. However, he had really expected to lose them in San Bernardino Strait, and now he was becoming aware of the fact that the whole Japanese staff in Tokyo had completely underestimated the American forces they would encounter. When he left Brunei, the best intelligence he could muster gave the Americans some 200 transports, 7 battleships, and an appropriate number of cruisers and destroyers in Leyte Gulf. He never received another intelligent piece of intelligence. He asked for planes to be sent from San Jose in Mindoro to scout the American force, but he never received the word, except that bad weather had kept the Japanese scout planes from carrying out the mission. By 3:30 p.m. then, Admiral Kurita was considering the future course of action, and he decided to turn back to withdraw outside the sea, past the effective range of American aircraft, and wait for the Japanese air forces in the Filipinas to get organized enough, which he really expected they might do to deliver counterattacks to the Americans. He did not realize that the Japanese land-based air and Ozawa's force were doing all they could, and it was like against biting an elephant. Here is the message Kurita sent to Combined Fleet. As a result of 5 aerial attacks from 6:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., our damages are not light. The frequency and numerical strength of these enemy attacks is increasing. If we continue our present course, our losses will increase incalculably, with little hope of success for our mission. Therefore, have decided to withdraw outside the range of enemy air attack for the time being, and to assume our sortie in coordination with successful attacks on the enemy by our air force. Now Kurita felt that the plan was already wrecked by the American attacks. The submarine and air attacks together had put him 6 hours behind time. The plan had called for him to make 22 knots all the way, which would put him into Leyte Gulf at 6 a.m. on October 25, while Nishimura coming from the south would get in about 5 a.m. But now, with 6 hours' delay, he could no longer even come within an hour of Nishimura, he figured. The 22-knot speed, far below the capability of the fleet, had been established because of the fuel curve. If they went faster, the tankers they had could not supply them with enough fuel to get home. Everything had begun very badly. And it continued badly. One reason Kurita decided to turn back was that he had received, at about 10 a.m., a dispatch from Nishimura stating that things were going sour down south too. The dispatch was not specific. The Fuso was hit, but not too seriously. But when accompanied by what Kurita and his staff had seen happening to themselves, they figured that Nishimura was resorting to a little Japanese understatement. And yet, inexplicably, while turning about himself, Admiral Kurita did nothing to change Nishimura's drive up from the south. Admiral Toyoda was anything but pleased by the message of Kurita's turnabout when it was sent at 4 p.m. He did not approve, and there was a suggestion that Kurita was doing less than he should. But aboard the Yamato, it was quite a different story. Admiral Ugaki, the diarist, was not party to the decision, but he did not disagree with it. It is true, if we are attacked by planes as often as this, it will appear that we have expended ourselves before getting to the battle area, but our situation being what it is, we can't retire even if we chose to do so. There is a doctrine that in each and every instance the fastest means of settlement should be elected. My opinion at the time of sailing was that the only means available to us was to sortie, determined to die. However, I am aware that to reverse course once until evening, in order to deceive the enemy, will be advantageous for tomorrow. Ugaki, who was there, knew that Admiral Kurita had no intention of retiring, but was trying to take the heat off his force, hoping for one of those miracles, that the Ozawa force would decoy the American planes away from him as it was supposed to do, or that the Americans would get the idea that he was retiring. A plane from the Intrepid noted the turnabout almost as soon as it occurred and notified his task group, which in turn notified Halsey. By 4:20 p.m. the message had been received. Admiral Bogan was cautious in his assessment of the change in course. He sent this message by talk between ships circuit, flash report. Third strike enemy force reported at 4 p.m. at 12 to 42, north 122 to 39 east, course 270, speed 17. This force has been 14 miles to the east of this position, but reversed course during time attack was over target. 2 battleship reported to be of Congo class were damaged and circling, apparently not controlled, at 12:39, north 122.48 east. The first was listing and afire. The second, less damaged, course to west, may be retiring or may be protection for cripples. Other reports came in from the other carrier groups, and they told of hitting battleships and cruisers and destroyers. The build-up was very strong aboard the New Jersey. By 8 p.m. many things had happened in the Philippines, and they were more or less summed up in the message that Halsey and his staff put together and sent out to Admiral Nimitz, General MacArthur, Admiral Kincaid, and the task group commanders of the Third Fleet. Here was what Halsey thought he knew. On 24th launched strong dawn search teams from 3 groups across Luzon and Visayas. At 7:45 a.m. search planes contacted enemy force 4 battleship 8 cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 13 destroyers, Kurita, 15 miles south of Mindoro. 38.2 Bogan launched strike immediately and repeated during day, 38.3 and 38.4. Sherman and Davison struck same force after initial strikes on their targets. 38.3 reported 1 cruiser, 1 light cruiser, 1 destroyer, Manila Bay, all damaged, estimate some damaged by blue subs. This was the Aoba force which was to take troops to the back of Leyte after first strike, 38.3 under heavy air attack and shot down about 150 planes. This was the series of raids that culminated in hitting the Princeton and was the major Japanese air effort of the day. Princeton heavily damaged, and Birmingham had personnel casualties resulting from explosion on Princeton while alongside her. 38.4 First Strike Enemy Force southeast of Negros, consisting of 2 Fuso-class battleship 1 cruiser 4 destroyers, making 2 bomb hits on each battleship, rocket hits on cruiser and 2 destroyers, strafed 2 remaining destroyers. None of these seen to sink. This was Nishimura's force, and main body reversed course to 270 about 2 p.m., when 30 miles east of Tablas Island and while again being attacked. Main body, score from incomplete reports. 1 Yamato-class bombed torpedoed left to fire and down at bow. Congo-class 2 bomb hits left smoking and apparently badly damaged. Bomb hits on 1 or both remaining battleship. 2 torpedo hits on one of these bombed battleship. 1 light cruiser torpedoed and capsized sheer fantasy. Torpedo hits on 2 cruisers and bomb hits on another cruiser. Overemphasis and exaggeration. And then came the kicker, as far as Halsey was concerned, representing new information that he had been waiting for, the missing piece of the puzzle. At 3:40 p.m., just after he learned that the Japanese fleet in the Sibuyan Sea had turned around plane from 38.3 Sherman-sighted enemy force. It was near 1810, north 125 to 30 report, evaluated as 2 ISE Class II cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 6 destroyer course, 210 speed 15. At 4:40 p.m., another group sighted 1825 north 125 to 28 east, 2 Zuikaku, 1 light aircraft carrier, 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyer, course 270, speed 15. This was Ozawa. At last Halsey's planes had found him, just when Admiral Kurita hoped they would, to take the pressure off Kurita 2 destroyer 100 miles northeast. This group course 240, Ozawa was still heading for northern Luzon. Planes from this force may have been attacking 38.3 prior to contact. Commander Task Group 38.3 has scuttled Princeton and is closing 38.2 and 38.4, which are now concentrated off entrance to San Bernardino Strait. Night air attack by enemy probable. More later, before 5 p.m. so much had happened. Halsey had now discovered Ozawa. Kurita was steaming back toward Brunei as far as anyone could see, and no one in an airplane above could read his mind. What a sad time it was for the officers and men of Kurita's fleet. Admiral Ugaki wrote, "When we reversed course, we passed by Musashi. My trusted Lieutenant Ugaki was commander of Battleship Division 1, remember, and her damaged appearance was too pitiful for words. All compartments which could be flooded were already flooded. She was listing about 10 degrees to port, and thought the Imperial crest was still visible. She was down by the bow. The deck line of the upper deck in front of the turret was barely above the surface of the water, and she had sustained 11 torpedo hits and several bomb hits. One of the bombs set fire to the ammunition, damaged the rudder, and blew away the No. 1 bridge, places on a battleship for which precautions are taken in advance. It is said that this bomb, which hit Theradar Bedspring, wounded Captain Inoguchi, who was in the anti-aircraft control station, in the right shoulder, completely destroyed the No. 1 bridge and flag plot. Make every effort to keep going was my fervent prayer. Further, as commander of Battleship Division 1, I suggested that the bow of the ship be beached temporarily in a spot of suitable depth off a nearby island and emergency repairs effected. No appropriate words of sympathy immediately come to my mind. Thus we passed Musashi, and when we reversed course once more, we passed by Musashi again near sundown, before 7 p.m. Yes, they had reversed course again, and Kurita had done so at about 5:15 p.m., after the American planes had seen him heading away. If he had planned to change course as he did, switching back as though frightened and running, and then turning around, he could not have taken an action that was more calculated to fall into the plans and thinking of Admiral Halsey. Here was Ozawa, just discovered. Here was Kurita, badly mauled, turned around. If Kurita had any doubts, and there is no indication he did, that his mission was to get to San Bernardino Strait at all costs. Then Admiral Toyoda in Japan straightened it all out with a message that came in from Combined Fleet at 6:15 p.m. With confidence in heavenly guidance, the entire force will attack, said Admiral Toyoda, which was as close to a furious remark as a fleet commander was to receive from headquarters. There was no question to be asked, timetable off, timetable on. The one big battle was still on, and that is how Admiral Ugaki saw the Musashi again and again that afternoon. It would appear that all of Musashi's officers and men are remaining at their posts without complaining. I thought that if things remained as they were, she might be able to hold out until the following morning. Tone, a damaged cruiser, is certainly a problem. She requested that she be allowed to join with the force in its penetration, and at 6:30 p.m. was ordered to rejoin its unit. Excluding some damage control personnel who remained aboard to help out, all other Maya personnel who had been accommodated on Musashi were transferred to a destroyer which pulled alongside of her. Imagine the plight of these Japanese sailors, torpedoed on Maya, picked up, sheltered on the big battleship, watched her smashed mortally, and now transferred again to go into further action on her third ship. The Japanese fleet of Admiral Kurita steamed on towards San Bernardino Strait and Leyte Gulf, not knowing what to expect. Kurita expecting only the unexpected, ready to do his duty to the death. He had thought he might lose half his ships. Now what could he think? He did not even know that the Americans had finally found Admiral Ozawa. A little over an hour after sundown, wrote Admiral Ugaki, a message was received from a destroyer, which had been ordered to stand by the damaged ship, that at 1937 Musashi listed sharply poor Captain Inaguchi. He had followed Admiral Ugaki's advice and had run for the nearest shore, but he could not change course in the slightest degree, as any movement caused the Musashi to quiver, and he was afraid that a change in heading would put her over. 3 of her 4 engine rooms were flooded, and on the last one she could barely move. Finally it had happened. At 6:50 p.m. the bows were completely submerged. Captain Inaguchi gathered his officers, ordered them to abandon ship, and went back to his bridge to be alone. A minute later, the mighty Musashi rolled suddenly to port, and sank so swiftly that she carried down nearly half her crew of 2,400 officers and men, wrote Admiral Ugaki. This is like losing a part of myself. Nothing I can say will justify this loss. Musashi, however, was the substitute victim for Yamato. Today it was Musashi's day of misfortune, but tomorrow it will be Yamato's turn. Sooner or later both of these ships were destined to come under concentrated enemy attack. My sorrow over Musashi's loss knows no end. But when one conducts an unreasonable battle, such losses are inevitable. Should Yamato tomorrow meet with the same fate as Musashi, I will still have Nagato, but there will no longer be a unit, and my existence as division commander will be meaningless. As I had already made up my mind that Yamato should be my place of death, I firmly resolved to share the fate of the ship. This was an indication of the Bushido spirit of courage and resignation that brought the Japanese to the place they had reached this night. Can a non-Oriental understand it? Probably not without years of study of the Japanese spirit. Here was a commander, knowing he and his other brave companions were engaged in a foolhardy venture, yet not complaining, simply determined to live and die by a code of honour. It no longer mattered that they expected to die, or that they could not win, or that their plans had come almost completely unscrewed. What mattered now was honour, and yet Ugaki and Kurita were responsible naval officers, concerned about professional matters as well as Bushido, as the events of the next hours would indicate. At 1951, wrote the Admiral, we changed from circular formation to compound column and continued westward. That was the indication that they were back on the attack and wanted to move fast. It would appear that the fleet headquarters has received a radio from Combined Fleet ordering our force to proceed ahead, trusting in divine faith. Today we underwent 5 or 6 air attacks, but neither our base air forces nor our own reconnaissance seaplane unit were able to report any definite information on the enemy. The extent of the information was that a task force was present east of Manila, and that the enemy fleet in Leyte Gulf had moved out, and there were no large ships in the Gulf. At any event, my firm belief has been that once we're able to transit the San Bernardino Strait, we should conduct search attack in the area where we are able to approach and contact the enemy. I have every faith in our ability to engage the enemy successfully. The only other thing which worries me is that the enemy will successively reconnoitre our movements tonight, and from after dawn will concentrate his air attacks on this force from a position over 100 miles from shore. Should this be the case, unless there is adequate cooperation from the base air forces, there will be nothing we can do, and our strength will be exhausted. We will have to expect decisive battle and annihilation with anti-aircraft action alone, so Admiral Ugaki went to bed as the Kurita fleet steamed ahead toward its rendezvous with who knew what. It may seem odd, but when Admiral Ozawa set out from Japan with his force of carriers and hermaphrodite battleships and lesser vessels, he hoped to be found even before Admiral Kurita entered the Sibuyan Sea. He wanted to do anything he could, including giving his life and those of his men, to assure Admiral Kurita's success in disrupting the Leyte Gulf landings. But if he were not to give his life, if the Ozawa force were somehow to be saved, then it would need fuel to make the round trip. So Admiral Ozawa sent his supply train out on another route to reach Amami-Oshima and there to wait for the Ozawa force. Strangely, Ozawa, who wanted to be found, was not found, and the supply force, which wanted to hide, started out and remained in almost constant trouble. The supply force was made up of 2 units. The first force consisted of the tanker Takan Maru and 3 escorts. The second force consisted of the tanker Jine Maru, the destroyer Akikaze, and 3 escort vessels. The first force left Tokuyama on October 21 at 9 p.m., an escort leading, 2 escorts on the flanks, and the tanker in the middle, zigzagging and making 13 knots. The second supply force would not move until midnight on October 23. The first force immediately began seeing and hearing things, and in taking evasive action, the Takane Maru had rudder troubles and lost her torpedo net. She reached the anchorage at Konya gratefully at 6 p.m. on October 23, but the second supply force was not nearly so lucky. It left Okinoshima around midnight on the 23rd, zigging and zagging, when suddenly at 4 a.m. on the 24th, an enemy submarine torpedoed escort number 132. The Akikaze was in the lead, escort 31 was on the port side of the Jine Maru, and escort 132 was on the starboard, with escort 43 behind, when poor 132 caught it. Everyone knew that a submarine was out there. The sonar contacts were definite, and escort 43 gave chase, pursuing the American ship, for that is what they were assured it was, for 51 miles from the Okinoshima light and depth charging. But there was no result, and escort 43 had a job to do, so it turned over the pursuit of the submarine to the Kura Defense Squadron and came back to its force, where the Akikaze and escort 31 were disposed one either side of the Jine Maru. But it did not find the force again, so the torpedo attack was doubly fruitful, sinking one escort and successfully diverting a second one from its assignment. This kind of breakdown of plans and communications was dogging the show operation everywhere, it seemed. What a disappointment it was to Ozawa, who was dispatching dummy messages and faking radio traffic of very heavy volume all the way as he steamed toward the northern tip of Luzon. Poor Ozawa did not know that his Zuikaku was having transmitter difficulties, and that most of his messages were not getting through. Not one of those messages was received by a friendly force. For such a trivial and extremely stupid reason, which too must be attributed to the technical shortcomings of man-made products and man himself, this unfortunate mission, which from the outset was a sacrifice hit, fell short of attaining its objective, Admiral Toyoda wrote. The Japanese were expecting miracles, Radio Tokyo was still boasting, all day long on October 24. The latest check reveals that since October 12, when the Japanese Air Force launched their first attack on the enemy in Taiwan-Formosa waters, the Japanese forces have either sunk or damaged 73 warships of the Anglo-American Navy, 17 carriers, 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, and early on the morning of October 24, the Japanese Air Force discovered an enemy fleet. And as the result of our attack during the day, 2 enemy aircraft carriers, 1 battleship and 2 cruisers were all heavily damaged. Admiral Ozawa's course and speed were taking him toward the island of Luzon, in a manner that he hoped would let him arrive about 250 miles off it at dawn, on October 24. On the evening of the 23rd, he decided that he would draw the Americans toward him and Zuikaku, the flagship, broadcast a long message at about 8 p.m. Unfortunately, and infuriatingly for a potential martyr, nobody paid any attention to the message. Either the Zuikaku's transmitter was still performing improperly, or something else was wrong. He was getting the message about the fate of Kurita's force all this time. He learned at 2 p.m. on October 23 of the data-dace torpedoing of 3 of the Kurita cruisers, and followed the changing fortunes of Kurita all that day. By evening, Admiral Ozawa had an estimate of the situation that was not quite correct, but was certainly logical. American intelligence already knew of the general fleet disposition, including his force. Here was Ozawa's estimate as to what the Americans would do. He will employ his task forces and land-based air strength to attack our first and second striking forces. To the south, the pincer forces. And when the first striking force makes its penetration, he will concentrate his surface strength east of San Bernardino Strait and in the Tacloban area and will seek decisive battle with us. Ozawa, then heading for the northern tip of Luzon, decided that at 6 a.m. on October 24 he would change course and head southwest to draw the enemy upward and away from San Bernardino Strait. At 5:45 a.m., he would launch his search planes and try to find the American carriers. If the planes found them, the one great wave of planes would be launched. Every effort will be made to recover aircraft aboard carriers in preparation for subsequent interception operations, Ozawa said. Now that was an odd statement for a carrier admiral to make, because in every carrier operation, the planes are automatically recovered at the end of the day, maybe not just once but several times. But there was reason for this introspective comment. Ozawa really had very little confidence that the planes could be recovered for a second strike. The pilots were simply not well enough trained to land again aboard the carriers, and in truth some of the aircraft they were flying were not well suited for carrier operations, for the bottom of the barrel had been scraped to put these planes together on the carriers at all. If the first search the next day failed to find the Americans, then a second search would be sent out after 2 p.m., planes would be launched to fight, and the enemy carriers would be diverted to the north. Then, in the event that the carrier planes and the movement of the force did not bring the Americans moving north and stop the pressure on Kurita, a part of the force would be sent farther south into the jaws of the enemy, to lure again. All this was planned in full realization that the Ozawa force was already low on fuel. Indeed, the Admiral noted that he expected only to have October 24 on which to operate freely, that thereafter he would have to send part of his force back to Formosa to fuel. If the planned operations did not do the job, then Ozawa would move toward Samar and attack again with whatever planes he had left on October 25. The planes would then seek shelter in the Philippines, because if that last event came to pass, it was almost certain that the Ozawa force would be destroyed.